Welcome to the Social Podcast, where no discussion or debate is off limits.
Welcome to the Thursday edition of The Social. Wonderful to have you with us as always. Welcoming to the combo our own Jess Allen, and broadcaster, comedian, writer extraordinaire Candy Palmater is with us all week.
So we're starting today with a difficult but really important story, which is the horrific murder of 8 people, 6 of them Asian women, in a shooting rampage that took place at 3 separate Atlanta area spas. So as details continue to emerge, we really want to talk about the way in which media has been covering this story. It's not being called at the moment a hate crime because police say they told reporters that the white male suspect targeted the businesses because of his sex addiction. So we know that there is actually an alarming surge in anti-Asian racism across North America. In fact, the Vancouver police, for example, reported a 700% increase in anti-Asian hate crime last year. So what do you think about the way in which Western media in particular has been covering this crime?
This is a really, really big one. And I hope we can take this opportunity today to talk directly to our viewers about how critical they are watching the news coverage of this story, because I think perspective matters a lot. I want to take a step back because I feel like you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to do the police work here when you take a look at the 8 victims. 4 of which are of South Korean descent, 2 of which are Asian, of Chinese descent. So that is the majority of the victims are Asian women. And so I don't know why out of the gate the police would already not be using the word hate crime, or at least at the minimum say they are investigating the possibility that this is a hate crime. Again, at least that language matters. But I also think diversity matters here. We saw that police chief yesterday saying, well, this guy had a bad day. He was at the end of his rope. Well, if you take a look at South Korean media, which they have reporters on the ground speaking to survivors, they're getting a very different story. And they are speaking to survivors who say that the alleged gunman killer said, I want to kill all Asians. So I think there's a huge gap right now that I think the media needs to dive into about who is covering the story, how this is covering the story, and the diversity with whom are tasked with investigating this horrific crime.
Yeah, I really wish that the media would pay attention to the notions of internalized racism. This is a perfect example of it. It happens with Indigenous stories all the time. It's not that you're overtly saying, I am going to be racist when I report this. But when a victim is an Indigenous person and you say, alcoholic, homeless, Indigenous man, right? You would never say alcoholic lawyer shot in the mall today. And that's where that internalized, right? You never hear that. But that's where that internalized racism comes into how they report. And it then skews the way everybody who takes in that media interprets it. And the one other thing that I just want to say really quickly that's making me so angry with this, why is it that when men have an issue, they call it a sex addiction, but for women, they slut shame us? It's such a double standard.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that sex addiction piece because I think, again, this is a story, of course, about racism. It's a story about migrant workers, vulnerable women, about mental health, religious shame, and so on. But it's interesting that this sex addiction piece, that's where my brain goes, because this is a term that pops up from time to time, and it's actually not in the DSM. It is a dubious assessment because there's no clear assessment about what actually constitutes a sex addiction. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder. In fact, I bet you, if any one of us, you can go online, probably people who are watching could do this, and actually do a sex addiction quiz. Probably all of us would qualify as sex addicts. It's a very problematic kind of allegation. Some of the questions include, do you watch a lot of porn? Do you use vibrators? Do you think about sex a lot? And so on. There is such a thing as a compulsive sex disorder, and it falls under the umbrella of other kinds of compulsions. But calling it an addiction is problematic. One of them? Is murder a compulsive behavior?
One of those compulsions that comes out of that?
What I'm referring to is more like compulsions, like, oh, I'm compulsive when it comes to gambling or shopping. The reason why I'm teasing this out is because basically, in many cases, this has been set up by people who have a religious bent. They want to diagnose because then they want to take people in and be able to reform them. It's not unlike the gay conversion therapy approach, which is that there is an idea about an ideal individual and how they should behave sexually, and we need to reprogram them to fit into that box. Why does this matter to this story? Because this person presumably has been told this. And when you're telling this by the media to the public, it can incur a kind of empathy for those who already have a lot of problems with sex and sex workers. That is why this is something, again, as consumers of media, as watchers of news, we have to listen for those kinds of terminologies and unpack them, because they're extraordinarily problematic.
To jump in. Yeah. I have to jump in because, again, the word sex addiction has come out of a police chief's mouth, taking the words of an alleged mass murderer as fact. I don't know that I believe that this guy is a sex addict. That's just what the police chief said that the suspect said he had. That could be a total lie, but he spoke it as if it's truth, and now we're treating it as such.
But I think what Cynthia's point is that, like, I think, sorry, Cynthia, but I think what you're saying is that there are people who are, especially white people, who are more willing to use that as a rationale for what happened than admit to the fact that there is systemic racism happening, that white supremacy is at work, and we're clawing and searching for anything, including sex addiction, to explain what happened when, as you mentioned, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes, I think, Mel, you said, to figure this out. But Mel, like, it wasn't just the police chief, for sure. I mean, the police chief going up there and being like, here's the reason that he gave us, and that's what we're sharing. But there was a follow-up question from one of the reporters, and the follow-up question was, is he remorseful? So to Cynthia's point, you're setting up a path to contrition now. You are sex addiction, and then the follow-up, is he remorseful? Well, like, to me, you're already telling the public, now let's care about whether or not he's sorry. And that, to me,
because he's having a bad day.
He's having a bad day. The path to contrition before we even know all the victims' names and who they were and their lives, like, that is what is, again, white supremacy at work.
It's so problematic. Go, Jeff.
Well, I wanted to say, going back to what Candy was speaking about, we have a comment on Facebook from Alana. If this same crime had been committed by a person of color, they would have pulled out all their past indiscretions, and no one would be saying he was just having a bad day. He also probably would have been shot, because he would have been seen as more threatening than this delicate flower that was just having a bad day. And Alana, you're absolutely correct. And going back to the media and how they're covering it, I know opinion pieces aren't necessarily news, but an opinion piece from MSNBC really spelled it out. Like, this writer said, the Atlanta shootings draw together three of this country's biggest problems: misogyny, anti-Asian hate, and lax gun laws. This guy bought a gun the same day that he murdered 8 people. And it sort of comes together into a single act of hatred. So if we're asking the question of, should we call this a hate crime? It's such a complicated question, because I think this is like the ugliest perfect storm of so many different problems all put together.
And, when people say, like, remember when Trump was calling it the China flu, and people would say, why are you getting so upset? It's just semantics. Semantics are real. Maya Angelou once said, words are real. They get on our hair, they get on our clothes, and eventually they get inside of us. And when they get inside of us, they start to affect our actions and our character and what we do. And this, what we just saw, is the end game of that. So semantics do matter. When you say it's okay for someone to call that the China flu, this is what happens at the other end of that. That's why we try to check people and try to educate people to check how they're talking about it. And when the media perpetuates that, I do not want to hear one more report about an Asian sex worker. I want to hear about some dead women, human beings. What they did for a living is not relevant to their fact that they're a victim. And when people say, oh, that person was an innocent victim, and this person is, an alcoholic Indigenous person, that's the problem.
Well, that's really,
that kind of language matters. And I think that is, but today, if you're online and you're trying to look for resources, the Asian American Journalists Association has actually tweeted out 5 guidelines for newsrooms to follow in their coverage specifically of this story, and language is a huge part of it, specifically the hypersexualization of Asian women, which is such lazy reporting if you were to go down that route in this particular case, because it's so reductive. It's just reduces these women to nothing more than, Asian sex workers, which P.S., we don't even know that for sure yet. That's another thing.
Exactly.
The other part
with language is
the media,
and I think it's an ugly thing to unpack, Mel, that we were connecting Asian-owned spas with prostitution, the media and the public, and there's no evidence.
We don't have evidence of that yet, but
when did they ever say 3 plumbers were shot today at the sporting goods store? Right? Well, that's what they do for a living.
Yeah, it matters. It matters. Exactly. It matters because, again, a lot of people, this is a Christian town. This guy was reportedly Christian, and so probably struggling with a lot of, and this is not to incur, again, I say this only because people in certain realms, religious frameworks, think of sex workers already as the epitome of evil. And so, again, to go back to claiming sex addiction, it's as if it's the porn that made me do it or the sex worker who made me do it, like the devil made me do it. And I think that, again, is just like, it's absolving any responsibility of the larger, multifaceted picture that led to this crime. And it matters. The nuance matters.
I mean, I think that a good place to start, though, Mel, in terms of media coverage is just when there is a full list of victims, getting the names right. One of my, I'm already nervous, and a lot of people in the Asian community, the East Asian community, is already nervous about these people were relatively invisible in life and whether or not they will be invisible in death in terms of how we respect their identities. These people are not going to have names like John Smith. Their names are going to be reflective of their backgrounds. And, one of those guidelines, Mel, that you mentioned, that the Asian Journalists Association has been putting out is know how to pronounce the names of the victims.
Please.
Lead with that. I mean, at this point, I'm sorry to say, I wish my expectations were higher, but if the names are said properly and often and pronounced properly, probably that would be enough for me to start. And that's sad. That's a low bar. But I think that is one way. If you're going to honor someone, especially when they've been murdered, get the names right, please.
It's the minimum. You said it's a low bar. So, yes. Listen, this is not going to end here. We are going to continue to follow this story. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more details over the days and weeks to come. And we will continue to cover this story and many others like it that sadly are happening across our continent.
As if we couldn't love her enough, Michelle Obama took Jimmy Kimmel down when she appeared on his show, and he weirdly asked her for the second time whether she and Barack made love after U.S. forces killed Osama bin Laden. She didn't answer, but turned it back on him, questioning his obsession with her sex life and comparing him to a little boy hiding under his covers with a flashlight. What do you think of all this?
What
do you think of this,
Michelle? I want to just high five her. First of all, selfishly, as a woman who's been trying to break into late night television for 20 years, if we could pry late night television out of the hands of men, we might not have so many of those faux pas happening. But the other thing that struck me when I saw it, I guess 2 things. One is, if that was Hillary Clinton or any other white former first lady, he would not have asked a question about her sex life. I think that goes to that whole, the fetishizing of certain races. It's just, I just think it would never have happened with Hillary. And the fact that Michelle slammed him, I love. Because people think when you are on a show that somehow you're beholden to that host. You are not. You can tell them to mind their own business if you want to. I have often been interviewed and someone asks me a stupid question or a question I've been asked a lot of times. I will just say, not very original. You might want to Google that. I've answered that 1,000 times before. Next question, please.
Oh, boy.
I do feel totally you're bang on there, Candy, because I just felt like I watched the whole clip just to see what was the tone leading up to it, because it's a comedy bit.
Yeah.
But I still found it highly uncomfortable, highly inappropriate. And what a way to diminish a woman and all that she has accomplished, both as First Lady and now as former First Lady. It is such an instant way to just cut her off at the knees and reduce her to, so was it a big night when your husband took down the biggest terrorist in the land? As if that event on its own isn't worth the respect and the dignity to just be left alone. He took it to a dirty place. And I think since the Framing Britney Spears documentary, we have all collectively, I hope, as a culture, started to look back and say, let's just keep our noses out of women's pants. It's not appropriate. Move on.
I appreciate these perspectives, but I have to say, like, the way I came at it, this was a 15-minute interview. He asked it at the 6-minute mark. He talks about her book before. The interview goes on after. She's laughing. He's laughing. The audience is laughing. He took a chance with a really stupid question. She shut it down in a really clever and pointed way. And the interview went on. I mean, Kimmel, like most late-night hosts or interviewers of any kind, including us, we're hoping to get an answer from a guest that hasn't been delivered before, which means asking unique questions. And it's probably safe to say that no one has ever asked Michelle. And he also asked Barack this question.
I think that's important,
for good
that
reason.
detail.
You know, like it's a stupid question, but he's taken a chance to try to get content that's, I guess, original. I don't know.
Just because he can doesn't mean he should.
No, I get it. It's a stupid question for sure. I mean, it's so weird. Like the implication is that were you horny after bin Laden was killed? It is very dark and weird. But I'm glad that he did ask Obama, who artfully dodged it as well. Yeah. He was just like very lighthearted, being like, I think Michelle was asleep. It's a stupid question. I would ask it. But when we talk about stupid questions that are asked, that's problematic. I definitely think every woman can relate to this stupid question, which is like the "Are you pregnant?" question. You've been hanging out. Probably a lot of us will get it after this pandemic is over because you gain a little bit of weight. You're wearing something that makes your stomach look less than flat. I have had so many people tweet out, and I feel like that is the most inappropriate. How have we not learned not to ask that? But other than that question, I feel like I would be open to almost any question. I like
Stay out of my uterus.
Yes, go, Candy.
Can I just say that I was at a drive-through window not 7 months ago, and the woman got all excited. She called me mama, and then she asked me when I was due. I'm a 52-year-old woman. And I happened to have a hernia at the time, so my belly looked even bigger. And you know what? I didn't want to make her feel bad, so I was just like, it'll be a few more months. Give me my peanut butter parfait and let me be on my way.
You didn't correct her?
No, she would have felt horrible. I was like, whatever, lady. I'm fat. Get over it. Move on. Give me my sundae and I'll go. But, you shouldn't make those kinds of assumptions.
No.
Yeah.
Never,
what do you do, Mama? What do you do?
But don't you like an awkward, like at a party, I would rather be asked a kind of slightly uncomfortable question, as long as it's from a well-meaning place, than to talk about, like, let's say sports. Like, Lainey, would you want to, you and I hate parties in the same way. We're always overeating, like by the food. And so I would rather some executive comes up to me and at least talks about something like, I don't know, even a tiny bit crass than to talk about, like, how about those Jays? I'm out.
I actually wish I could get asked more about sports. I think that's part of it, is that, like, you think you should ask certain people certain questions, and do you ask girls, celebrity interviews, for example, how often are the females being asked about, hey, what do you think of how the playoff race is shaping up? What do you think of, do you think that who's going to win the premiership this year? Whatever. I mean, they ask that of men. They don't ask that of women. I'd actually prefer if they made that question equal opportunity to everybody.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
To subscribe to the Social Podcast so you don't miss a fiery debate. Until next time, socialites.